Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at this Kleinbahn Austrian made HO gauge Austrian Bundesbahn or Austrian State Railways 1245 electric loco. Now this is my loco that I've bought to run on the Garden Railway. I do like the Austrian locomotives. I've been to Austria several times and I do find the continental stuff quite interesting. Growing up near the Nene Valley must have spawned that interest, as they had a lot of foreign stock when I was growing up. This is a first for me. This loco is actually articulated, so it'll be interesting to see what we find inside. And the roof there, as you can see, is absolutely caked in dirt and dust. Who knows when it was the last time this loco ever ran in service. So I'm going to give it the quick battery test now and see if there's any life in this. I was told that it run, but didn't run very well. But giving it the battery test there, it's showing no signs of life whatsoever. It's completely dead. It's not even attempting to turn over. So we're going to have to strip this model down and see if we can rectify it, and hopefully also fit a digital decoder. Another first for me is the way this loco is put together. There are two screws in opposing sides on the loco body side there that hold it to its chassis. The screws are colour coded to the body side paint, so you can't really tell. And then opening it up, I'm surprised to find that it's actually built for picking up off the pantographs. And this insulator pot on the top here actually moves. It's a switch. You can put it in either hole and it either picks up directly from the track or directly from the pantograph. But it was seized in the hole, so using a screwdriver I push it out, put it in the pantograph hole, and then put the body shell back on to see if we can get it to run from the pantograph. The only piece of metal I had to test this, other than using the crocodile clips there, was a metal ruler. So I put a crocodile clip on the track and one on the metal ruler, and when I put it on the pantographs, as you've just seen, the loco is actually a runner. But it's not picking up from the track, so it still needs a strip down. But this is the first for me. I've not got any engines at all that would run from overhead electric wires. This is quite a neat feature, and I know Hornby had it in the 1980s, but this is a first for me. Now, stripping this model down, it is quite complicated. It's a convoluted design, if I'm honest. Removing that ballast weight on the back there, and then I remove this small brass screw here which releases the light unit. I'm going to remove these light units, and I may fit an LED kit in the future and wire it up to digital, but for now these bulbs are going to be removed. I have to make a mental note of where all these screws go, as they're all flathead screws and they all look similar, but as you'll find out later when I come to reassemble it, they are actually all subtly different. To make this easy, I'm going to unsolder this blue pickup wire off the pantograph pickup on the roof there, just to release the body shell completely. I also unsolder this brown wire from this wiring loom here, and then the body shell is separate, and we'll deal with that later on. I also snip off the wire for the lights there, and I put the lights in my spares box. Now, to try and disassemble this weight here is held on by a bolt which also holds the gears on. But by lifting it up, I can get to this screw and hopefully release one of the wheel sets. As I said, this is quite a convoluted model to put together, and you see that chassis plate there comes off over the top, but the bogies are all still fastened together. I've got a suspicion that part of the motor mounting is holding the bogies together, and as I said, that weight there is held on by that bolt, which also acts as a pickup and has got wires soldered to it. So I undo all the screws on the bottom, and this middle screw here, this large screw, actually holds the motor in place. And then these two screws here release the base plate for these two middle wheels, which act as pickups for the loco. The outer wheels don't actually contribute to the running at all. There we go, there's one of the bogies off, but the other one is stuck, as I suspected and said, with the mechanism from the motor. And the base plate has simply just popped off there, revealing the wheel and gear sets and also another brass pickup. But now the motor's free, I gently pull it out of its housing. Well, I would do if I could. I've now got to unsolder this wire which is soldered to a bolt. This really is a strange loco, and I had to refer to the footage many times when I reassemble this later on. Just going to snip that wire there, and then the motor comes free. The motor worm gear on this is actually a spring, and I've never seen anything quite like it. The magnet, however, is extremely powerful and will pull screws from a good 6 inches away towards it. I then undo this screw here, which releases that weight, and the bolt falls off, and I put them all in the magnetic tray for reassembly later on. This took some working out how to get this part out of here as well. In hindsight, I should have took the gears off because I end up taking them off anyway to clean them. But by laying it on its side there with the big gear facing upwards, it is a case of then it just simply slots over, and be careful not to damage that pickup there. Now we've finally got this model disassembled, as I said, I can honestly say I've never seen a model quite like this, or put together in this way. And as for this motor, well, this is all kinds of weird. It's not easy to take it apart because the worm gear doesn't come off. These springs here act as conductors to the brush springs, and then when I actually do take it apart, the brush here that you see, this is a carbon brush, much like Hornby Dublo, with a groove in it for the spring to sit in. And this has got plenty of life left in it, as it's really long, and it seems to have hardly been worn at all. And there we go, it just fell out there. As you can see, that's quite a large brush. And the other one on the other side wasn't a brush at all. In fact, it was a coiled up mass of what seemed to be copper mesh. I have never seen this before, ever, and I was baffled. I thought they had to be carbon brushes to make the motor run. To release the magnet, you simply undo 2 more flat-headed screws from the motor faceplate there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to unscrew these, pull the motor down as far as I can to access the armature, and clean the commutator. And clean the gaps in the commutator to make sure there's no carbon buildup. Some of these screws are really stuck firm and took quite a bit of force to get them off. I don't know if this model has ever been disassembled since it left the factory in Austria, probably in the late 70s or early 80s. I get a bit nervous now, as I do not want to damage those tiny copper wires from the coils. However, gentle persuasion pulls the magnet off, and here we are left with the armature and the coils. But I can't disassemble it any further than this, otherwise that would mean removing that spring, and I don't want to remove that because I might not be able to get it on properly. Using my usual method of cotton buds and methylated spirits, I gently push the cotton buds in there and give it a twist to clean the commutator. But when I start this, it becomes apparent that the commutator is actually quite clean. So I'm not sure why this loco wasn't running. It must have been a pickup issue. By pointing the cotton buds like that, it gives me better access, so I just give it a good clean anyway. And then I'm going to use a trimmed up toothpick to clean out the gaps in the commutator faceplate. Once the commutator plate had all been cleaned, I get the magnet and the rear bearing on some blue roll here and just give it a quick clean with this contact cleaner, just to remove any dried up lubrication that was left on the model. Whilst this is out, I also give a squirt down each of the brush holders onto the faceplate and then let it evaporate naturally before I attempt to reassemble this motor. This contact cleaner really is good stuff. To reassemble the motor, you must put these washers in, and as you can see there, the magnet keeps pulling it off. But this is a spacer that goes on the rear shaft of the motor there, and this shaft goes through that bearing. If you don't put the spacer on, the motor will not run properly and will be in danger of damaging itself. As you can see, this was quite a difficult task, because every time I tried to put the motor back together, the magnet pulled the washer off the back of the shaft there. Lining up with a cocktail stick, I managed to put it all through and then push it firmly home. Once the motor's back in place, it's a simple case of refitting the 2 flat-headed screws that we removed before. As I've said in many a Trash to Track video before, do not over tighten your screws, as you do not want to strip any thread out or damage the plastic parts, as I find that this plastic and metal interface isn't very good for hard wearing and can wear quite easily if you're not careful. The brass brush went in that side there on the left hand on the picture. I checked this by reviewing the footage again, and this brush with the groove in it went on the right hand side as you're looking at it now. So I put this in with a pair of needle nose pliers after I give it a quick clean up with a cotton bud and meths. But as I said, there's not much coming off this. That black stuff there is actual carbon off the brush itself. So once that's cleaned, I drop it in with my needle nose pliers and then line up the spring there onto the groove in top of the brush, which holds it in place. You must ensure, as you do with Hornby Double-O, that the spring is lined up with the groove, otherwise the brush won't be on the commutator plate correctly and the motor won't run properly, and it could lead to excessive wear on the brushes, or it might not even run at all. This was a gentle operation as I was conscious not to break any of those small springs or the small linkages on this motor, otherwise I really would have been stuck. Like I said, this weird brass brush thing, I've never come across this before. If you know of any other locos that have this sort of thing, please leave a comment below. I'd be interested to know if this is a common thing or just something that Kleinbahn did. I put the brass brush in this plastic tub and give it a good scoosh out with the contact cleaner there, just to remove any dirt that's got into it, as it's like I said, it's like a fine mesh. And then I put that back into its hole and then replace the spring, which has a tiny pin on the end of it. It's like the spring is like bent, so the bent bit goes in the middle of that brass brush. And then I give it a quick battery test and the motor seems to be running lovely. It's not the quietest of motors, but it's running nice. Now I've got the brasso out, I'm going to give the pickups a bloody good polishing, as it must have been the pickups that were causing the running issues, as the loco ran fine when the Pantograph was applied. With power. So using a cotton bud and working gently, you'll see that the brass comes up and shines really nice. Another thing with these wheel top pickups, and I must admit I'm not keen on these, as they can bend out of shape and they have a tendency to scrape any muck off the wheel treads as it's going around, and it can easily lift them off the wheels. Lima 08 shunters have this pickup arrangement and I've never been a keen fan of it, as like I said, it's not very reliable. So I give these a good clean, or clean them as well as I can, before we try and attempt to reassemble this model. This brass strip here, this actually fits inside this die-cast chassis part. I wasn't going to take these off, these drive cogs here, as I was going to give them a good brush over with this stiff brush just to remove any fluff and fibres that were there. There was no lubrication on this part of the model whatsoever. This was actually bone dry. There wasn't even any remnants of old lubrication, so whether or not it ever had any, I don't know. I then give the wheels a good clean with a fiberglass pencil and then my cotton bud and methylated spirits method. And as you can see, there is quite a bit of dirt on these wheels that comes off relatively easily. To pull the wheels apart and get the cogs off, you have to take the wheels off the axles. So I didn't bother doing that. I just cleaned them as well as I could with them in situ. Pulling them off the axles would have just created a lot more work. And then if you damage the axles again, as I said, the model would be pretty much useless. Reassembling the model, I did this incorrect at first. I tried to balance the brass inside the die-cast bit, but what you actually do is put the strip on top of the axle mounts there and then put the die-cast bogie plate back in. This will only go in one way, and then once it's in place and screwed back together, it goes on with a satisfying click, and just make sure all the wheels are freely rotating. Once it's all screwed back together with these tiny little flat-headed screws that go in each end, remember the screw hole in the middle there goes straight into the motor and holds that in place. Once these are in, I get the leads off an old controller that I use to test these models, and with the power applied on the crocodile clips, I place one on the screw and one on the wheel treads there. If it shorts out and sparks like it's doing here, that tells me that that brass piece inside that bogie is actually resting correctly, so I can rest easy and know that they're making contact. I've just put the motor in there just to give me an idea of what it looks like, and then I lubricate the axles and put a small amount of oil on the drive gears. Again, when reassembling this model, I had to refer to the footage quite a lot of me disassembling it, as I just could not remember how it went back together. It didn't seem to go back together in any sort of logical order. As you can see there, I'm also adding the usual silicone grease onto the worm gear and put the battery on it just to spread the lubrication through the drivetrain. This will save me doing it later on. Now it's time to look at what else we've got in here, and the couplings on this model are European and they're not going to be any use to pulling stock around the layout outside. So I'm going to unscrew that tiny screw you see in the top there and drop these wheel units out and also the coupling unit. By undoing this, the whole thing just falls apart relatively quickly, as you just saw there. And if you manipulate the wheels round, or the wheel unit round should I say, you can access this other screw which was hidden, which actually holds the coupling in place. This model really isn't built for taking apart any sort of ease. I've got these two NEM couplings here that I think are from an old Bachmann Class 25, and I've trimmed it down a bit to fit through the slot here, and then it will be screwed in place in lieu of those European couplings. By reattaching the original screw through the NEM coupling there, I am really pleased with how these couplings fit, and it will allow this loco to pull UK stock on my garden railway. Once it's on, I manipulate it through the hole again, and then re-secure this pony wheel back in place with its original screw, and then the same was repeated for the other bogie. Now it's time to reassemble the model, and I take this nut and bolt piece off, which releases these drive cogs, and then the articulated bogie sits in the middle there, and these plastic bogies fit in little gaps on the die-cast chassis. Ensure that the pickup goes over the top of these, as I initially thought it went underneath, but it doesn't. Using my needle nose pliers, I hold the nut there while I tighten that screw up to hold the drive cogs in place. Now it's time to screw these two bogie pieces onto that middle die-cast chassis using these two small flat-headed screws. And again, I had to reference the footage I'd already taken so that I could see which screws went where. And these two have a small shoulder on them to allow the bogies to pivot and the loco to articulate. And now it's time to fit the motor, and this really did prove difficult, as holding the motor in place and then turning the model upside down to put the screw in, you had to line the screw up with the hole in the motor, and it really was not easy. I really do admire the dexterity of the people that made these models in the factory. As the time this was made, this would have been put together by hand, I think. I then put the rear mounted weight on there and screw it into its corresponding hole, once the holes line up with the screw thread, that is. And then I look at putting the other weight on, although it's now I realise that the chassis plate should go on really. So I go to fit this and realise that the weight goes on after the chassis plate again. Again, this model's thrown up another curveball, so now I've got to take that weight off again and then apply the chassis plate. Once the weight's been removed, I simply thread that pickup wire through, and the chassis plate lines up with those lugs on the front pony wheels there, and then it screws into place. These tiny brass washers sit on top of this screw pillar there just to add a little bit of clearance and allow the bogies to pivot as it goes round corners. Once the screws are lined up, I use a small flat-headed screwdriver just to tighten these screws up, and it holds the chassis plate all back in place rather nicely. Now it's time to reapply the other weight, and holding the nut here in a pair of tweezer nose pliers, I line it up with the screw thread and then turn it a few turns with the pliers until it's tight. Once it's on there tight as you can get it, the model is getting well on the way to being reassembled. Once it's all in place, I give it a quick once over. I have no leftover screws, so I must be doing something right. Now we've done the chassis and the motor plate, I'm going to take a look at the body shell, which is in dire need of a good clean. I release the pantographs, which are held on by two flat screws, flat-headed screws that you undo from underneath, and the pantograph just falls off, as does this plastic insulating piece that has the insulators moulded onto it. I'm conscious while doing this I don't want to break any of that top copper wire there that actually conducts electricity from the pantographs to the pickup module inside the body shell. Once it's all been removed, I can actually remove that pickup wire because it's soldered in from the other side. I get my toothbrush and gently wash the top with some warm soapy water to remove most of the dust and muck that seems to be stuck to the roof of this model. It appears that this model was stored somewhere for a long period that has allowed it to get this dirty, although the sides and windows aren't too bad, which is a bonus. Once I've gone over the entire roof and removed as much as I dare with the toothbrush, I then get damp cotton buds and just clean off the rest of it. As you can see, the toothbrush didn't remove it all, and just polishing it up with the end of a cotton bud here removes the rest of the dried on crud, and the roof actually returns to a nice silvery grey colour, whereas before it was quite dark and dirty. To make the pickups a bit better, I use a cotton bud dipped in some Brasso and just put it in the post there where the insulator pot switch fits into each one, and then I push a cocktail stick through, and as you can see there, by turning it through, it removes all the dirt and grime that's inside these brass tubes. That method worked rather well, and I had nothing else to put in there. I also give the switch itself a clean up with some Brasso, and now they're all been cleaned, hopefully they'll conduct electricity a lot better. I also put the end of a flat bladed screwdriver into the switch here, and just to open it up slightly, as years of use pushing it in and out the holes would have closed it up so that it wasn't making complete contact with the brass strips in the roof. Once that's all done, I thread the wire back through the roof and put the insulator pot into the hole where it will be used to pick up electricity from the track rather than the pantographs. As you can see there, that's all back in place. So now I'm going to refit the pantographs after giving these plastic bits a bit of a wipe. Whilst I was at this, I actually did clean the ends of the copper wire as well with some Brasso, but I didn't get any footage of that. Not that it has been very riveting anyway. So I hold the pantograph in place with my finger, when allowing all the holes to line up, and then tighten the screws from underneath, again with the small flat bladed screwdriver I used to remove them. Again, the dexterity of people putting this together must have been amazing, as it is quite frustrating, as every time you turn the body upside down, the pantograph moved and it lost its alignment, but we got there in the end, and I refit both pantographs in this method. These pantographs on this model are rather delicate, and I'm glad we've got this far without breaking any. Now I'm going to look at fitting digital decoder to this model, and this is my standard Bachmann decoder that I use, and I've actually unsoldered the 8-pin plug off this. Picking out the red and black wires that I need, and also the orange and grey ones, the spare wires I actually keep to one side and tie in a knot, so that if I do ever fit a lighting kit to this model, the wires are there from the decoder. I'm not trimming them back too far so that it's easy to solder should I ever fit lights to this model. Again, simple DCC fitment with this, as I'm not putting lights in it. Red and black to track, orange and grey the other way. So I solder the red and black wires to the pickups and the orange and grey wires to the motor terminal. I do unsolder these springs, as I think they're a bit surplus now, and I don't understand what they were there for in the first place. They're connected to the brass brush holders, so I just unsolder them there and keep them in the spares box in case I need them. But then I solder the orange and grey wires directly to the motor terminals with the brushes, and then that should provide power without having to go through that spring. And it's just one less thing to have in the body shell while trying to fit in all this extra wiring. Now that that's done, I'm going to give the red and black wires a quick battery test to make sure that this motor is capable of sustaining a decoder. And once they're aligned, you can see there that the motor was turning, so I'm good to solder the pickup wires together. I'm going to solder the black wire to this brass bolt here where the pickups was on. And don't worry about the smoke there, that is just the flux burning away that I put on the bolt to allow the solder to flow onto it. And the red wire will go on to the track pickups and also the pantograph pickups, which I've wired into this. Should I ever have a DCC system that has working overhead line, this loco will be able to run on it. I solder the blue wire back onto that contact in the roof, which is where we removed it from earlier on. And this really does take care, as the last thing you want to do now is melt the body shell or put the soldering iron on the sides and ruin this body, otherwise it will undo all our hard work. It's no good having a working chassis if the body shell's rubbish. The last job was to solder the other pickup wire to the brown wire that comes out of that insulator pot on the roof, and then I put some heat shrink tubing over it just to stop and prevent any short circuits in the future. The heat shrink tubing was shrunk with the heat of the end of the soldering iron. Now we can give this loco another test before I refit the body shell onto it, and then we're getting to the end of this rebuild. Before I refit the body shell on in its entirety, I am going to give this a quick battery test to make sure there's no short circuits and that it's running correctly, and then we'll look at putting the body shell back on. I'm pleased to see that this is running rather nicely, a far cry from when we started this, when it wouldn't pick up any electric from the track at all. The decoder there is simply going to fit on top of that weight, and I'd almost forgot to put these light units back in, as there is a gap in the chassis plate for them to fit. There is one to fit each end, and then I also put the brass screw back in, which was used to hold the bulb in place when we first took this apart. Not only did this hold the bulb in place, but this also held this lighting unit in. Now that that's all done, as I said, I'm going to keep the decoder on top of that metal weight there, as the decoder is wrapped in its own shrink plastic, and it's held in place with a piece of Tamiya masking tape. The other wires are held in place on the other end, and the body shell is put back on just after I took the wires in there. Now that everything's tucked in place, I secure the body shell with the 2 red screws that are left over in the metallic tray. Then we'll go on to testing, and I'll be interested to test the pantographs this time to see if the decoder will pick the power up from the pantograph. I'm pretty certain it will, as I'm convinced that the wiring is now complete. Testing the loco on a power controller, and you can see there that it is running on the track. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the same principle before with a crocodile clip on the metal ruler, and apply it to the pantographs to see if we can get this loco running. And as you can see, it runs off its pantograph as well, so that proves to me that all the wiring is now correct. I give this a thorough test like this just to make sure there's no short circuits, and I test each pantograph individually to make sure that the copper wire that we fiddled with earlier when we washed the roof hasn't broken in any places. And as you can see there, both pantographs work correctly. One last job before we go to the turntable scene is I'm going to reapply the white lettering to the side of this body shell that is all worn off. Using a very fine brush and some Tamiya white paint, I work steadily and gently and repaint all the lettering on the side of the loco, and also all the handrails back to silver, just to give this Austrian Railways locomotive a touch of class again, and it doesn't look so worn out. So this is what we started with. This Kleinbahn Austrian or Austrian State Railways electric loco was a non-runner from the track, and its roof was coated in layers and years worth of dust and dirt. However, the pantographs did work, which was a bonus. We've completely stripped down this model and rebuilt it from the ground up, and I must admit it was one of the strangest rebuilds I've ever done, with one of the most unusual motors in it that I've ever seen. But at least now, if I ever work on a Kleinbahn engine again, I'll know what to expect. And this is what she looks like now. She's all been balled up and cleaned, her lettering has all been repainted on the sides, and she's been thoroughly cleaned and shines like a new pin. Her interiors have had a complete overhaul from the ground up, and she's also now digitally fitted to allow me to run her on my digital railway round the garage and when the time comes outside. The excuse being that the Preserved Railway have bought her and converted her to battery operation, which will allow her to run off the pantographs and overhead line without it being there. I'm going to leave you now with a couple of shots of it running round the layout. First off, when I was testing it, it's on some Mark 1 stock, which looks a little bit wrong. But then, as anybody would have seen in the last Gems or Junk, I actually bought some Swiss coaches, which I'll leave you watching run round with some accompanying traditional Austrian music, which I really do think sets the scene. If you've got an engine you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Track, please email me at dansmodelrailways@gmail.com, and we'll look into getting it sent over and possibly featuring on the channel at a later date. Please like, share and subscribe. Thank you all for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.